Welcome back to this sixth class in our confirmation program. Today's lesson we learn about a person, a rather remarkable person in the Old Testament, named King David. We learn about his life, his successes, his setbacks, and how the nation of Israel really came into its own under his leadership. To this point in our course, we've learned about a number of important figures in the Old Testament. We studied about Adam and Eve, the first people. We learned about the patriarchs from Noah through Joseph, the people with whom God established a covenant that would last not only for them, but for all of their descendants. We learned last week about Moses, how he led the people in slavery in Egypt out to freedom and led them towards the promised land, and also gave them a law from God that would guide their lives and shape them into a holy people. Today, we learn about another figure about 300 years after Moses called King David. And he's significant in that Israel kind of comes into its own under his leadership. While they were set free by Moses, it really wasn't until King David that a nation of Israel was firmly established. Also, King David was remarkable for his integrity, his righteousness, his faithful heart, and his altogether success, both as a leader and as a warrior. Lastly, King David is remarkable as he was not only a competent leader, but he was a wonderful poet. And many of the songs that we have recorded in the Bible were actually written by David. This is the person that we'll focus on today. But before we get into him, we got a little bit of backstory leading up to his arrival on the scene. Now, where we left off at our last lesson, Moses had given the law to the people. He continued over the next 40 years to lead the people through the desert and the wilderness towards the promised land. They encountered numerous obstacles on their journey, and it took them much longer than it would have otherwise been expected. But eventually they come to the edge of the promised land. Moses passes, and it comes to another guy named Joshua. The book of the Bible named Joshua is about his leadership. He takes the helm and guides the people there into the promised land and gets established there. What follows is a few hundred years of basically some scattered leadership. There are people called judges, and the book of Judges, which follows Joshua, talks about them. There's a dozen different judges that over time are sort of semi-rulers. They decide disputes, they lead in issues of conflict, but Israel is generally without a king. They regard God as their king, and no one is above or over them. They just rely on these judges who seem to kind of rise up at times of crisis or need, and then sort of go back to normal life as soon as the crisis is passed. Altogether, they are people who put their trust wholly in God. However, as time goes by, they begin to clamor. Just as they complained to Moses in the wilderness, so they start to get a little peeved that there are other countries around them that are strong and have wealth and power and have a king. And they kind of now also want to be like them. They want to have a king and have a strong country and have a strong army and have, a wealthy setup for themselves. And so finally they pressure one of their prophets named Samuel to ask God to give them a king so they can be kind of like everybody else. Well, the Lord isn't entirely pleased with this because he's made the people to rely on them. But because of their persistent begging on this matter, he finally relents, and through Samuel, a guy named Saul is anointed as the first king of Israel. Now, the people are pleased with this. However, Saul, as good as a guy he was to begin with, he makes some major mistakes. He moves forward too quickly. He doesn't seek the will of the Lord. He takes some offices that don't belong to him and doesn't follow through on what God leads him to do. As such, God finds that he's not quite the guy cut out for the job and appoints another person named King David, or who will be King David, a guy named David, to take his place. That's where David's story begins. Now, David, when we first meet him in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel, is a rather unremarkable figure. David is the youngest of boys in a large family, and his job is the very lowly job of looking after the sheep in the field, feeding them and protecting them. Now, after King Saul's shortcomings and mishaps, the prophet Samuel is sent to find a new king to replace him. He comes to David's family, and lining up all the brothers in the family, he identifies David as the one who will next rise up as king after King Saul. At the same time, there is an enemy to the Israelites known as the Philistines. These Philistines are constantly making war against the Israelites, and the Israelites in turn are constantly making war against them, and this continues for many centuries throughout the Old Testament. At this time, the Philistines again are making an attack on the Israelites, and among the Philistines is a very noteworthy figure called Goliath. You may have heard of him. He's an enormous guy. There's mention of how large his shield and his spear are. He's just a huge, hulking kind of guy. And every day for 40 days, he leaves his camp and comes up to the Israel camp and says, "If you will field any person to fight me, I will take them on one-on-one. And if they win, then all of us Philistines will be your servants. We'll give up. However, if I win, then all of you have to give up and become our servants." There's no one in the Israel camp who will take up this challenge because Goliath is just so enormous. However, David hears of this, and he goes up to King Saul and asks for permission to go and accept Goliath's challenge. Saul initially thinks King David or David is being silly because he's just a small boy and a shepherd. However, David demonstrates to him that when lions had come and threatened his sheep, he was able to put them down. When bears came and did the same, he was able to handle the bears. He thinks that he can actually take on and take down this Goliath. Saul eventually relents, and King David goes forth into this famous fight between Goliath on one hand and young David on the other. Goliath thinks that this is some kind of a joke. This little boy is accepting his challenge. However, King David is confident. Or he's not quite king yet, but he's confident. And he takes out his sling, and with a few stones, he does indeed take down Goliath. After this fight, the Philistines all flee. They break camp and they take off. And this victory of David sets him on a path towards kingship in Israel. It's a significant moment in his life. After this fight between David and Goliath, and David comes out as the victor, the people hail him as a great hero, which is good for the Israelites, but not as good for the existing King Saul. King Saul is jealous of all the attention and the acclaim that is given to David, and eventually he's so filled with envy that he seeks a way to kill David. David picks up on this and he flees. And for the next lengthy period of time, he spends time running through the wilderness, fleeing Saul's troops, allying with some of Israel's enemies just to keep himself alive and to keep beyond the reach of King Saul. Eventually, however, Saul's good fortune runs out. And Saul, in another future conflict with the Philistines, is defeated, and he and his cohort are vanquished, and Saul in this battle is killed. It is at this time that the platform is finally set, and King David is hailed and anointed as the next king of Israel. This is what really establishes David as king, and in the ensuing years, as recorded in the book of 2 Samuel, David has a series of conflicts in which he emerges victorious, leading the Israelite armies in victories over all sorts of surrounding tribes, which solidifies the position of Israel as a great country in the area, finally bringing them peace and prosperity and a sense of strong national identity. This is the great success of David, and it is through his reliance on God, his integrity, his righteousness, and his prowess, that he's able to not only win on the battlefield, but be a very effective leader at home as well. However, after years of continual success as king of Israel, David makes one big blunder, a huge mistake that rocks his kingship and strongly negatively affects his family and his children's lives as well. What happens is that after a time, David perhaps gets a little complacent and he gets comfortable in his role as king. And one day, as he's on the top of his palace, he notices across the way that there's a lady taking a bath. She's a beautiful woman named Bathsheba. David is immediately drawn to her, and he summons her to his palace, and there he basically makes her his girlfriend. However, Bathsheba, is already married, and she's married to one of David's army commanders named Uriah. This was, of course, a huge wrongdoing to get involved with another man's wife, as David chose to do. However, it's made even worse. David, realizing that she is Uriah's wife, now seeks to kill Uriah, to get him out of the scene so that he can have Bathsheba as his wife. And he sets that trap so that Uriah will be in battle, that the other soldiers and commanders will pull back and leave Uriah exposed so that he'll be killed in battle. This does indeed take place, and Uriah is killed in battle, and David makes Bathsheba his wife. However, this, of course, does not go unnoticed by the Lord. And you can kind of count on how many different ways that this is wrong. And we learned the last lesson about the 10 Commandments. And how many of the 10 Commandments did David just break here? I mean, he committed adultery. He coveted another man's wife. He murdered, essentially, by setting up the circumstances for another person's death. These were grave mistakes. And eventually another prophet comes, a guy named Nathan, and informs David of his wrongdoing. And David recognizes all that he's done, and he's indeed extremely sorrowful and repents. Through this, even in this catastrophic failure, God is faithful to David. God recognizes that David is truly repentant for his wrongdoing, and continues God's covenant with the Israel people through David. What is really on display here is God's amazing power to forgive, even in the greatest of evil that can be committed, and also of his steadfastness to the covenant that he's made with King David's ancestors and those who will come after him. However, because this is such a grievous mistake, it is now without its natural consequences. What follows in the book of 2 Samuel is basically a great civil war. David's son Absalom rises up in rebellion against him. He has his own jealousy issues, and creates an army, and the two go to battle for an extended period of time against one another. David's leadership in the kingdom is rocked. He eventually emerges victorious in this struggle and regains his kingship. But in the ensuing battle, his son Absalom is killed. Some of his close friends die as well. And the whole country, which had been stable and prosperous, was thrown into a time of internal war and conflict. David comes through this in one piece, but certainly not unscathed. And it's a testament both to God's abiding faithfulness and commitment to his covenant, and also to the real consequences of sin, even among the most righteous and upright of people. Through this lesson, we've provided an overview of King David's life and times. However, in the reading for this coming week, you'll get to know more of the details, the shorter stories that paint a fuller picture of King David's life. These stories, these small decisions that he made, these finer aspects, reveal him to be a truly remarkable man. He is, by and large, a man of great integrity, interested in justice. He was a man of righteousness before God and had a great devotion to God. He was incredibly able as a commander in the battlefield, but also as a leader for the entire country. And in generations to come, King David will be looked up to as a model king. Those who follow will constantly hearken back to not only David himself, but the times of David, as this is when Israel comes into its time of greatest prominence and power and prosperity. Also significant is that David is not only a commander and a king, but he's also a very gifted poet. In the next lesson, we're going to look at the Psalms of the Bible, many of which are attributed to David. And he, even amongst his many conquests and exploits, was a man of profound devotion and sensitivity to his religious life with God. This same devotion and psalms which lead the devotional life of many Christians today. Lastly, David is important because the prophets that will follow will proclaim the advent of a Messiah who will save the people of Israel and redeem them from their sin. This Messiah who is to come is to come from the lineage of David. That is, David not only sets the scene for an Israeli country, but he is the ancestor, setting the stage for the all-important Messiah who is to come. God bless you in your studies this week. I hope you find King David's life interesting. It's a great story, but also inspiring. And hope you will join us next week as we get into some of the writings that he himself left behind, as recorded in the book of Psalms. God bless, and have a great week of study. Bye-bye.